Joining us right now is John Mowrey. He is CIO and Senior Portfolio Manager at NFJ Investment Group. And, John, Joe asked this in the last block, but do you think the sell-off at this point has stopped? Do you think there's more to come? Are we going to slide back into correction territory with the S&P 500? What are you thinking?
I mean, a couple things I would say. Near-term things do look oversold. However, I think things are ripe for further volatility. For one, you have tight financial conditions. You have a lot of discussion around tariffs. Some have been implemented, some have not. But I think the biggest thing that we are watching are very high valuations, particularly in large cap growth. If you look at where that index is trading, it's higher than it was in 2018 when we had a 25% drawdown peak to trough. It's also in line where it was before we had the sell-off of a 35% drawdown in 2022. So I think valuations with those two elements are something investors should be paying close attention to.
Okay, so maybe not signaling the all clear just yet on any of this. We've been so focused on tariffs and what's the moment-to-moment headline with those things, but you think it's really the technology and the semiconductor sell-off that is something that we should be paying more attention to?
It's been going on for longer than people think. If you look at the SOX index, the semiconductor index, that actually peaked in July, of last year. And it's down on the 1 year. So the semiconductor index has really struggled, and the NASDAQ's down, more than most indexes, down 10%, 11% on the 1 month. If you look at other areas of the market that have been catching a bid that have been real laggards, such as REITs, which you have names like Prologis, American Tower, up 10 and 12% year to date. So I think there's some real interesting areas that are positioned quite well, which have very attractive valuations and should benefit should rates come down.
Why do you think the sell-off there has been so extreme? Is this going back to the considerations with what China came out with earlier this year in AI? Is there something else with questions on the valuation?
Well, I personally think, even though it was kind of pushed to the side, I think the DeepSeek news is a bigger deal that people discuss. And the reason for that, I think, is it lets in the concept that we actually may have a little bit of a crack in the armor, that there may be a tougher time given that there's been so much spending with AI, and we may not need to be spending as much. And if you pull back some of that spending, it starts to break down how all these models are put together for earnings, and that also is going to cause multiple contractions. So I think that that is something that investors are worried about. And I would argue that if you look at areas that are overseas, for example, particularly in China, that's a market that's done very well this year, not getting a lot of press. The euro now is 109. That continues to weaken or strengthen relative to the dollar. You have very low valuations overseas. I mean, Alibaba's up 75% year to date and is trading at 14 times earnings, and they're an AI play. So I think there's a lot of ways to get exposure to that theme at a much lower multiple. And one other thing I would say, Becky, a lot of people discuss around if Trump would be real hard on China. But I would remind investors, the last time Trump was in office, the Chinese index was up 100%, beating the S&P 500 over his 4-year term.
Yeah, and in fact, President Trump has been hinting that there's going to be a meeting with President Xi coming maybe as soon as June or even earlier.
Yes, and I would argue that even though that Mexico and Canada are very important trade partners to the U.S., if you look at their contribution to global GDP, it's around 2%. China makes up around 1/5. The U.S. makes around 25%. Okay, so it is in the best interest for global prosperity for China and the U.S., the two largest economies in the world, to work together and find some agreement. And I think when you look at supply chain networks, that's going to be critical to keeping inflation down, which is something the Fed's focused on.
Outside of Alibaba, are there other names that you're watching pretty closely?
Yes, there are other names, such as JD. It's another technology name trading at just 10 times earnings. It is also up 35 or 40% year to date, but it's a logistics play, significant net cash position. You have all these names that got washed out. A lot of Chinese companies got completely villainized because of what was occurring with policies here in the U.S. I think that some of that was needed to some degree, but you've had a total washout, Becky. So I think that when you look stock by stock, you've got real opportunities overseas.
When it comes to China, David Tepper was on the show. When was that, Joe? Maybe 6 months ago? Maybe.
I'd hate to try.
Talking about his.
It probably was 6.
Yeah.
Maybe less.
It was
about 6.
Yeah. He came on, though, and said that this was the place to be. We've seen a huge surge in Chinese stocks since. Is it late to jump onto that wave?
No. No, so I would argue that the call that he made was very good. The rally actually started at Halloween of 2022. If you look at the bottom of the Chinese stock market, which was on that date, Halloween of 2022, it's beating the S&P 500 by 20%. So I think the rally has a long way to go. The valuations are still below where they were when Trump entered office at the end of 2016, when you got that 100% rally in Chinese equities.
When you're looking at semiconductors, Nvidia, obviously the 800-pound gorilla in the room on all of this, they've got their second day of their developers meeting. Jensen Huang's going to be speaking today. What does he need to say? What does the market want to hear in order to kind of push higher?
You know, something that is concerning when I look at Nvidia is it has exceptional earnings growth, but it continues to have multiple contraction. And that, I think, signals that investors are concerned about the future prospects of that earnings growth. So people are going to be paying very close attention to any signals he can give for future demand from the large hyperscalers. But as my kids would say, it's a little bit sus that we keep seeing multiple contraction in a name that has very good earnings growth. Generally, when that happens, the market's anticipating something coming out where the earnings may not be able to sustain that trajectory.